Hello and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Museum of Art and Photography to an online walkthrough of our photography exhibition, The Business of Dreams, co-curated by Varun Nayar and myself, Nat Gaskell. The exhibition tells the story of Suresh Punjabi, a studio photographer from the central Indian town of Nagda in Madhya Pradesh, who began making portraits in the 1970s.
The business we refer to in the title is Studio Suhag, which Suresh opened in 1979 and which has since served as a fixed point against which Nagara's many transformations can be seen. In the decades after Indian independence, as the town grew as a commercial and industrial hub, so did the dreams and aspirations of its people, who came to Studio Suhag with varying ideas about how they wanted to be represented through the camera. To first introduce you to Suresh and his work, we'd like to start by screening a short film, which we made in collaboration with the documentary collective FARAWAY Originals. We'll now be turning our videos off, but for our audience at home, we'd encourage you to make your window full screen at this point.
एक महिला कुछ सहमे और कुछ असहमे कदमों के साथ स्टूडियो में आई है। ये शायद उसकी पहली तस्वीर है। वो शर्मा रही है, लेकिन फिर भी एक हल्की सी मुस्कुराहट उसके चेहरे पर चुपके से आ गई है। एक्सपोजर चेक। उन्होंने इस लम्हे की कल्पना कई बार की होगी। यह लम्हा जो अब एक तस्वीर के रूप में पहले उनके होने वाले पति के हाथ में नजर आएगी और बाद में उन्हीं की दीवार पर। फोकस चेक। उन्होंने सबसे बेहतरीन कपड़े और चुनिंदा जेवर पहने हैं। वो नागदा से है, लेकिन इंदौर जाना चाहती है। दुनिया को अपनी मुट्ठी में करना चाहती है। चेहरा इस तरफ, धीरे से कैमरा की तरफ अब मुस्कुराइए। कुछ 45 साल पहले मैं इंदौर से नागदा आया था। मेरी जेब में कुल मिलाकर 365 रुपए थे और हाथ में यशी का कैमरा, जो मेरे पिताजी की भेंट थी। 365 रुपए यानी एक दिन का 1 रुपया, 1 साल के लिए। जाहिर सी बात है, मेरे पास खुद का फोटो स्टूडियो बनाने के लिए पैसे नहीं थे। मुझे लोन की सूझी। नागदा के बैंक मैनेजर ने मुझे लोन देना तो स्वीकार किया, लेकिन कहा कि शहर के 7 बड़े व्यवसायों में से आपकी कौन गारंटी देगा। निश्चित 7 गारंटी देने के लिए तैयार हो गए और मैंने एक व्यवसायी से गारंटी दिलवाई और कुछ इस तरह मेरा कारोबार शुरू हुआ। और शुरू हुई नागदा से मेरी दोस्ती। इस शादी की फोटोग्राफी मेरा पहला काम बनी। मुझे इस परिवार से काफी सम्मान मिला। उन्होंने मुझे अपनी खुशियों का ही नहीं, बल्कि अपने परिवार का भी हिस्सा बना लिया। यह छोटा सा नगर अपना सा लगने लगा और हर तस्वीर इस रिश्ते को मजबूत होने का एक प्रतीक बनने लगी। जल्दी ही नागदा घर जैसा लगने लगा। नगर के हर कोने से लोग अब मेरे पास तस्वीर खिंचवाने के लिए आने लगे। मेरे काम का सबसे जरूरी हिस्सा था यह जानना कि वे कैसा दिखना चाहते हैं। मैं उनकी छवि से उन्हें परिचित कराना चाहता था। आने वालों में से कुछ लोग ये जानते थे कि तस्वीर व्यक्तित्व के अलग अलग भाव दर्शाती है। उनमें से कुछ लोग चेहरे पर पूरी सफेदी चाहते थे और कुछ लोग शेड फोटोग्राफी कराना चाहते थे। जब उनको उनकी संतुष्टि के मुताबिक तस्वीर मिल जाती थी, उसके बाद मैं उनकी एक तस्वीर अपनी संतुष्टि के लिए लेता था। इस आखिरी तस्वीर में मैं उनको अपने नज़रिए से जाहिर करने की कोशिश करता था। उस तस्वीर पे आप मुझे उनकी आंखों को टटोलते हुए देख सकते हैं। फोटो खींचने का काम दिन भर चलता, रात में उनको डेवलप करने में जुटा रहता। रोज दर रोज यही काम होता था, लेकिन मुझे कभी अकेलापन महसूस नहीं हुआ। इन्हीं तस्वीरों के जरिए नागदा में एक दूसरे को पहचानने और समझने लगे, बिना शब्दों से बातचीत करने लगे। जब भी मुझे वक्त मिलता, मैं नागदा के नजदीक गांव चला जाता। जब मैं इंदौर से नागदा आया, यानी एक बड़े शहर से छोटे नगर में, तो मेरे घर वालों और दोस्तों को काफी ताज्जुब हुआ और थोड़ी घबराहट भी। लेकिन उनकी चिंताओं के बावजूद मैंने अपने आप को नागदा की ओर खींचते हुए महसूस किया। यही खिंचाव मुझे नागदा के नजदीक गांव की ओर भी ले गया और वहां एक संतुष्ट से बड़ी साधारणता का एहसास होने लगा। वहां समय की चाल धीरे थी और मुस्कुराहटें तेज। वहां के अपनेपन की बात ही कुछ और थी। वहां के लोग जितने अनोखे थे, उतनी ही अनोखी उनकी कहानियां थी। और वहां की चाय में गांव वालों की हंसी एक अलग मिठास भर देती थी। चाय, हंसी और जिंदगी, उन लोगों ने हर चीज मेरे साथ दिल खोल कर बांटी। उनकी संगत में जैसे मुझे और मेरे कैमरे को अपनी एक और आवाज मिली। आज का नागदा एक छोटे नगर से बड़े शहर में तब्दील हो रहा है। इस बदलाव की कहानी को मैंने खुद बढ़ते हुए देखा है। बाकी लोगों को शायद यह बदलाव सेल फोन जैसे आधुनिक उपकरणों के माध्यम से दिखता हो, लेकिन मुझे इस बदलाव का अनुभव तब होता है जब मैं नागदा के लोगों को फोटोग्राफी की तरफ बढ़ते उत्साह को देखता हूँ। ऐसा लगता है जैसे कि मेरी खींची तस्वीरों के जरिए वे दुनिया से खुद का परिचय करवाना चाहते हैं। दीवार पर सजी तस्वीरों ने जैसे खिड़कियों का रूप ले लिया है। अब लोग सिर्फ इन्हें देखते नहीं, बल्कि इसके माध्यम से दुनिया को देखने लगे हैं। आज जब मैं अपनी सारी प्रेरणा अपने बेटे को दे रहा हूं, तो उन हजारों तस्वीरों से एक बार और मुलाकात हो चली है। उन तस्वीरों के जरिए उन सभी से जो नागदा और आसपास के गांव से मेरे छोटे स्टूडियो में आए थे, जिनसे मिलना मेरी तकदीर में लिखा था और जिनसे जुड़कर मेरी तकदीर में 4 चांद लग गए। इन यादों का दौर करते वक्त मुझे एक एहसास होता है कि वे सब लोग दुनिया से अलग अलग मोड़ से मेरी जिंदगी और मेरे स्टूडियो में आए थे। कुछ शहर से तो कुछ गांव से, कुछ हिंदू, कुछ मुस्लिम, कुछ सिख, कुछ ईसाई, कुछ सजीदा तो कुछ नटखट, कुछ अमीर, कुछ गरीब, कुछ खुश और कुछ दुखी। लेकिन जो भी आया और जहां से भी आया, कैमरे के सामने आते ही उनके सारे अंतर खत्म हो गए और रह गया सिर्फ वो अंश जो मेरी फ्रेम में नजर आया, एक अमर छवि जो जीवन काल के पार है।
Before we enter the exhibition, I wanted to say a few words about how this particular archive came to be part of the map collection. By the 1970s, there were literally thousands of photography studios in small and mid-sized towns across India, each of them housing archives of tens of thousands of negatives documenting the lives of people who visited them. In this sense, Suresh's archive is representative of a lot of studio photography from this time, and the style of his images may seem familiar to many people listening in today. I first came across Suresh's work at a talk given by the photo historian and anthropologist Christopher Pinney at the Delhi Photo Festival in 2013. Suresh's pictures really stood out from everything else at the festival, in my opinion, and I thought that they should have a place in the museum, along with the more canonized parts of Indian photographic history. I went to meet Suresh in Nagda to discuss my idea and our plans to make it publicly available as an archive. MAP subsequently acquired 10,000 of his negatives from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and we have been busy archiving and cataloguing his work over the last few years. It's a real pleasure, therefore, to now not only be able to bring these to wider public attention through the film, but also through this exhibition itself. I think we may have lost Varun for a second, so I will take over his part for now until he comes back on. So our walkthrough of the business of dreams will further explore many of the themes brought up in the film you just saw, from the attention Suresh paid to the way in which his sitters wanted to be represented, to the images that this approach helped produce. While working with the possibilities and limitations of the online space, we decided early on that we wanted the exhibition experience to flow along a linear narrative, structured around what we considered the four main types of images that sitters commissioned from Suresh: administrative, group, individual, and outdoor portraits. Interspersed among these sections are broader discussions of the political and social environment at the time, its relationship to the institution of the photography studio, the diverse visual references that Suresh and his sitters brought into their studio, and a consideration of his work's significance in a global context. The exhibition also welcomes deeper exploration. There is a larger central narrative arc, which we will walk you through today, but also a number of overlapping and intersecting micro-narratives found in the descriptions of the images themselves. Much like a traditional exhibition, viewers are encouraged to chart their own path through the website, and we do hope you'll spend some time after exploring the website in your own time. So the exhibition opens with an image of an unnamed farmer from Madhya Pradesh, who in the early 1980s walked into Studio Suhag to have his portrait made for the first time in his life. As we, along with Suresh, have spent the past few months going through many thousands of images that comprise his archive, this one image in particular has come up time and time again as an evocative example of Suresh's approach. While the purpose of the photo is unclear, the man's wide-eyed stare suggests that the camera either caught him by surprise or that he was overly exerting himself in an attempt to pose appropriately. Because of its rather straightforward composition, one might think the portrait was made to serve a civic or administrative purpose, perhaps one for a ration card or some form of government entitlement. As far as assumptions go, this one wouldn't be far-fetched. About a third of the images Suresh made in his studio were of this type, and they form the first section we explore from his archive.
Take, for instance, the man in this photograph, who insisted on a full-length portrait, showing his crutches so that he could qualify for disability benefits. The care with which Suresh has placed the three lights in the front of the man tells us how, even for these rather standard images, he was always in conversation with his sitters and their needs. This is doubly relevant considering that by the late 1970s, identity documents had embedded themselves deeply into Indian civic life. Standardized portraits became necessary for many administrative activities, from accessing food subsidies to completing job applications. Suresh's studio provided an essential service, and for Nagda's poor and working classes, it became one of few ways in which the presence of India's creaking bureaucracy was felt. When placed side by side, these images highlight the sheer diversity of Suresh's clients, who appear almost as a mosaic of faces, registering the state's efforts to make them legible citizens.
There was, of course, much more to Suresh's work than administrative portraits. Life in Nagda at the time, like in many towns in India, moved along a network of overlapping social relations, romantic, platonic, filial, communal, or professional. As photography opened up new opportunities for self-presentation, these relationships seeped into Studio Suhag as well. Nagda's growth into an industrial centre in Madhya Pradesh was felt increasingly by the smaller villages around it. In addition to its local population, people from these villages, as well as others travelling by train through Nagda Junction, also visited Suresh's studio, which had a diverse clientele including Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, Christians, and Adivasis from neighbouring regions. As the town grew, people began visiting studios more frequently and often in groups. Suresh's sitters brought their social worlds into the photographic space, and he worked to represent them against this context. The resulting images show us packed families, impassive co-workers, bashful lovers, playful friends, and various expressions of cultural and religious celebration, connections seen and unseen caught mid-pose.
The online format also allows us room to experiment with the different ways in which we could bring the context behind these images to the fore. For this image in particular, we used a set of red focus points, wherein each click opens up more context to different parts of the image. This portrait, we learned from Suresh, was commissioned by Behru Singh and his son Lakshman, both train porters at Nagda Junction. Both are also photographed wearing the copper armbands that are synonymous with the profession. At the time, the armband stood as an especially charged symbol of working class pride, later crystallized by the release of the blockbuster Coolie in 1983, in which Amitabh Bachchan plays a porter from Mumbai. Objects such as the copper armband were among a range of references and attitudes that people brought into Suresh's photographic space. One example of this from the archives is a portrait of two young boys who brought their goat to the studio during Bakra Eid. The goat is adorned in a floral garland, and one of the boys is holding it by its neck while both stare down Suresh's camera coldly. Though the image's unlikely juxtaposition can seem comical at first, it makes me think of how much of Suresh's work is owed to his generosity as a person. His camera was always an open invitation, without judgment or prejudice, for anyone who was interested in having their portrait made at the time. This, I feel, is one of many ways in which the history of Indian studio photography is deeply streaked by the social character of the places where businesses such as Suhag Studio emerged.
One image that really stuck out from this portion of the archive is one where these three young men are sitting shoulder to shoulder. My understanding of it is purely speculative, but I just enjoy the sense of genuine friendship and camaraderie that it captures. We often think of portraits as celebrating an individual, whereas here it's really a celebration of the idea of friendship, of people deciding to have their photograph taken together as something they feel important enough to memorialize. Having got to know Suresh a bit, I can also easily picture him being involved in composing the scene, understanding what the sitters wanted to convey and helping them create this.
In addition to these one-off portraits, every so often, an occasion would warrant more photographs. Mostly these are weddings and for clients who had the money. One of Suresh's homemade photo albums was an obvious choice in these cases. These typically included roughly 250 to 350 images with varying interventions from Suresh, from touching up the surface of the image to producing themed hand-drawn frames within which each photo could be pasted.
While Punjabi's group portraits allowed him a certain degree of creative flexibility, it was the portraits he made of individual sitters, often young people, where his technical acuity and artistic talent came through on full display. It wouldn't be far-fetched, for instance, to assume that the man standing in a three-piece suit with flared trousers and his hands on his hips knows he resembles a young Amitabh Bachchan. In fact, on first meeting the man photographed here, Suresh remarked how much he resembled the actor. His distant stare, along with the studio lights peeking in from either edge of the frame, lends a credence to the fiction that this man is perhaps a body double preparing himself for an actual film scene. Though distinct in their setup, what unites these individual portraits is the dialogue that produced them. Although always behind the camera, these arrangements also carry bits of Punjabi in them, as he frequently helped clients create poses inspired by the language of dreams and cinema, as well as their own disposition. Each image expresses a kind of playful formality, somewhere between conviction of a performance and the irregularity of rehearsal.
More than any other set of images from Suresh's archive, a theme that runs through his individual portraits is the aspirational and near dreamlike quality of the Hindi films of the time. Suresh grew up in the waning years of what many call the golden era of Hindi cinema, from which he regularly drew inspiration when developing his own visual style. When we asked Suresh if there was a single influential film that captivated him, he almost immediately mentioned Guru Dutt's Pyasa, which was released the same year he was born. Studying the way Dutt used light and shadow to deepen the emotional conflict in the film, Suresh developed his own painterly approach to his own compositions. Although Hindi cinema had a significant impact on Punjabi, it was still a part of a larger network of influences. Crucially, his work also captured how people from a fast industrializing town articulated their evolving ambitions, wherein a particular posture or a prop could reveal a variety of personal preferences and worldviews.
Looking at this image decades after the fact, Suresh recalled that this young man came into the studio asking for a portrait that would make him look like, quote, a smart gentleman photographer. The magazine camera and tie featured in this image are all props. The yashika slung on his shoulder, which belonged to Suresh, is an especially interesting detail. It was a pricey piece of equipment that didn't typically circulate beyond urban markets. Its existence in this portrait speaks to the sitter's self-proclaimed desire for smartness, signaling a degree of professional and socio-economic mobility.
The final and most infrequent type of images that comes up in Suresh's archive are those that he made outside of his studio. Although Studio Suhag was a microcosm of social and cultural life in Nagda, no account of its history would be complete without the photographs Suresh made when he was away from his counter. Though not strictly making portraits, Suresh was nonetheless comfortable on foot, owing in large part to his teenage years, when he spent a lot of time as a traveling photographer. In this photo, for instance, the first one on the left. In this photo, for example, the subject doesn't see the bright flash of Suresh's camera as he dances energetically alongside the wedding band and many of the guests at his friend's wedding. A good wedding photographer must be invisible. Suresh's knack for framing an image inconspicuously and at the right moment reflects in a number of his outdoor photographs, especially of ceremonial events.
Looking at Suresh's archive altogether and researching the history of studio photography in India more broadly, two seemingly competing ideas emerge quite clearly. Suresh's approach to photography developed from his own unique set of experiences, references, and interests. Yet, at the same time, as mentioned earlier, he was also one of thousands of such small-town studio photographers working across the country, a history that often gets hidden behind the more mainstream story of photography in India. Our hopefully careful consideration of Suresh's archive inevitably opened us up to the possibility of thousands of other archives, likely just as socially embedded as Studio Suhag's, which may have emerged from similar interpersonal and commercial exchanges. In fact, even looking beyond the local context of Nagda and the national context of India, we see that the trajectory of studio photography in the country was comparable with other places around the world. This begged the question, could Punjabi's portraits have parallels elsewhere? And what might be gained from placing him in a global dialogue with other studio photographers outside India?
Across the global south, photography studios have historically been steeped in a particular kind of elite colonial legacy. But as the medium became more accessible over time, especially during the 20th century, they also became spaces for great experimentation in artistry. After the wave of decolonization that swept much of Asia and Africa in the middle of the 20th century, a new era of studio photographers emerged, who engaged deeply with the distinct social contexts in which they worked and lived. In looking for Suresh's Nagda elsewhere, three photographers stood out to us as particularly interesting points of contact. There's Hasham al-Madani, who photographed for nearly half a century in Lebanon. Malik Sidibe, whose studio work played a significant role in how post-colonial Mali was pictured. And Pornsat Saktenbrai, whose portraits of subjects from rural Thailand captured a nation experiencing rapid urbanization in the latter half of the 20th century. Among these, Sidibe's remains my personal favorite. And finding this sense of visual congruency between images such as these was a highlight in researching this section. Broadly speaking, comparing these photographs allows us to better see an aesthetic and ethical concern that all four of these photographers shared, which was, more than anything else, an abiding respect and faithfulness towards community and place. In our effort to produce this conversation, we also had some crucial help from the Arab Image Foundation, as well as the Kathmandu Photo Gallery, both of which instinctively understood the value of creating such a dialogue.
So, as we've hopefully hinted, this is just one perhaps simple way in which we can understand an archive such as Suresh's, but we hope that people will visit the exhibition online and also look at the many photographs individually, outside of any forced kind of narrative, and just enjoy looking at the portraits and coming up with their own responses. So we'd now like to take some questions from the audience, which Varun, you will be reading out, I believe.
Yeah, I think we're still waiting for some questions to come in, but I think I can start us off, Nat, sort of with a question for you. I think I came on a little later in this process, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the early phases of finding Suresh's work and what was sort of the state of the archive before sort of you started engaging with it, and what were your initial inclination? I know you spoke about this in the intro a little bit, but perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, when we talk about these tens of thousands of negatives, it was actually originally a much, much bigger archive, which if you read Christopher Pinney's book, he sort of tells this story about how it was very badly damaged in a monsoon storm. So at least 50, if not more, % of the archive was kind of completely lost. So even at the time that I went up to meet Suresh, we knew we were only dealing with a part of the archive. And that too, because he would typically only take one picture, sometimes two, and that physical print itself would be given to the client, all that really remained was this archive of negatives. So in the first stages, really what we were doing was having the photographs scanned and then showing them to Suresh and sort of trying to eke out the similarities that we did to sort of compose it into a narrative.
Yeah, it's a strange balance. I mean, even sort of the treatment of this archive, I know we've had a number of discussions about it, but I think that balance between preserving sort of the uniqueness that's captured in each image and sort of respecting the faces that appear throughout this archive and the unique work of Suresh Punjabi, while also acknowledging where this exhibition might sit in its display of studio photographs, and how that might hopefully start a greater conversation about the history of Indian photography that's a little bit more broad. Right now, I think one of the sort of provocations that we were working with early in this planning process was how does Suresh's archive move beyond the documentary mode, and sort of what can it tell us purely from a visual and stylistic perspective, but also from a sociological perspective, in a limited sense, of course. So I think those two sides of Suresh's artistry and sort of unique approach to photography, while also acknowledging the material history of studios, thousands of them being all across the country, was tricky, but also a rewarding part of the process of planning this exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can finally just sort of say that as part of this project, we've also, if you go into the online exhibition itself, we've put together a timeline which sort of charts the whole history, which is not so subjective as the way we've looked at it. But there are also two academic essays, one on the history of Suresh's studio itself, which is also available in Hindi as well as English, and one more broadly on the history of studio portraiture, which includes the more kind of formal royal mercantile history of studio portraiture that is sort of more known. Obviously, this interest in local studios has kind of become more fashionable recently, but until the last sort of 10 years, it was really just these royal portraits and ruling classes who kind of found their way into the history books. So I think that essay is a really fascinating insight into that whole story. And also for those who are interested, we wrote a afterward where we discuss some of the problems, ethical and curatorial, in putting forward a collection of personal portraits into the public domain. So for people interested more in the kind of historiography side of things, they can read that. And finally, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at more MAP events in the future.
Nat, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but before we end, I think we have some sort of last minute questions that have come in. So shall we answer that before closing things out?
Yeah.
I think it actually points to a couple of interesting aspects that we haven't yet discussed in the exhibition itself. So Ankur Vora asks, what was the technical process to acquire images? Did you photograph the archives, or were they physically scanned?
So to begin with, they were physically scanned. I mean, we used a negative scanner, a not particularly impressive one, but really just to kind of make equivalents of contact sheets, just so we could see what we were dealing with. Then once we had decided on 100 or so images into this exhibition, we sent them to a lab in Chennai called Inspire Madras. And Kartik, who's the proprietor there, who's an absolute kind of genius with chemistry and the history of photography, and has been working with film photography for the last 40 years in India. He, rather than scans them, he actually photographs the negatives on a light box. First of all, he cleans them. And it's much more accurate to do the cleaning process on the physical negative as opposed to scanning it and touching it up on Photoshop. So obviously these negatives were not in a particularly good shape. So he really spent a good month or so cleaning the negatives, and then he would photograph them and then really do very, very minimal touch-up work afterwards. So the tones that you see in the images online, they're not from prints, they're from the negatives, but they're incredibly accurate to how Suresh himself took the picture. We really didn't interfere with that at all.
Another question that we have from Indra Chaudhary is, Suresh says that he took a last photograph of his subjects on which left a trace on his subjects. Could you talk a little bit more about this mode of self-consciousness? Perhaps I can start with this one. So I spoke with Suresh about sort of this final image. He mentions it in the film itself. But one of the things that I find most fascinating about Suresh's relationship to his clients is sort of there is very little sense of hierarchy or sense of even professional difference, or this idea that I perhaps am the person who has the professional background in photography and you are a person who's walking into a studio for the first or second time. A lot of that is flattened, especially in his exchanges. And nonetheless, so a lot of his photographs that he took were sort of in the form of a conversation, in ways in which he kind of at times even embodied the way in which his sitters wanted to be seen, sometimes even miming poses. But he does insist on this idea that he had, especially sort of when he had been running Suhag Studio for a few years, that he would also constantly be experimenting in his own way as he was doing sort of his regular day job. And that's something we didn't want to shy away from when sort of presenting this exhibition, the fact that it was a business and it did sort of allow Suresh to lead a certain kind of life and develop relationships with the community, but also sort of it had a real material impact on his life. So in that sense, this sort of last photograph that he took of people was almost an expression of his own artistry in a way that it wouldn't make sense commercially. These were things that he was doing for himself at a time when he didn't necessarily know what he would do with those negatives, but they were always an expression of a certain style that Suresh has, which is always practicing, always tinkering and trying new things. He went through 4 different types of cameras throughout his career and is entirely self-taught. So I think, to answer your question more directly, that sort of final photograph to me shows sort of that enduring trace of him tinkering even much later in his career and always trying to sort of find new ways into representing his subjects. Yeah, I think we can close things off on that unless you have something else to add.
No, nothing more from me. So I think actually my colleague Priscilla just wants to run a poll before we wrap it up. So she will take the stage for a few minutes. And thanks everyone for their time.
Thank you.